It's good to have all you here this morning that are in person, those of you that are online. We got the box cast back up so you guys can watch us. Glad that you're here this morning viewing us online. Well, we have a treat this morning. Our Wesleyan church, that this is a denomination of, spans a huge geographical area. So you take Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. I think I got them all. I may have missed one in there. So it's a huge geographical area. And so the district leader for this church is going to be here speaking this morning. His name is Wes. He's my boss, so be nice. Be nice, okay? No saying things bad about me now. Hey, I got a cowboy choke for you. I shared this yesterday. It's been approved, so school's around the corner. I know some of you kids are sad about that. But it's just around the corner. But you know what the daddy buffalo said to the son buffalo when he was first day of school? Bye, son. I know, corny, but it's funny. All right, Wes, would you give him a round of applause as he comes up, would you?
Thanks, Tom. Well, good morning, everybody. It is fantastic to be here. We have over 100 plus churches in 11 plus states, and I can tell you that having taught in all of them, you're the hottest church we have on our district by far. Wow. I'm going to be pretty wet up here in a few minutes, I think, but it's really great to be here. And more seriously, you need to know that there are churches everywhere in the Northwest region that are praying for you every weekend. Churches of thousands, churches of a few dozen, and they are praying. This has just been an experiment on our part, this cowboy church idea, and we're loving what God is doing through you all. Keep up the great work. I tell people in large stadiums or small gatherings that there's a group of people meeting in a barn and they're having a blast and they love the stories. So thank you very much for what you're doing. Your pastors gave me the privilege today to teach God's Word, which is just my favorite thing to do. And in spite of the fact that it's warm in here and all the rest, I'd love to engage with you in a story that I know you've heard before, but I'd love to engage with you in a new way, in a way that has in recent years enormously impacted my life, really impacted my life. So I want to take you to the story of David and Goliath, which 90% of you have heard something about David and Goliath. If you're like me and you grew up in a church culture, I heard this story since third grade Sunday school at least. I've loved the story. I love stories of slingshots and swords and some violence and a little gore mixed in. And so, what's not to like? But there's a problem with this story. It's so familiar to most of us, we've quit learning from it. And the second problem with this story is, I don't know about you, but I have never in my life, nor do I expect ever in my life, to encounter a 9.5-foot guy who wants to kill me. Just doesn't seem to be relevant. My life is full of what I consider to be giants, challenges that overwhelm me, that are more than I can handle, but they aren't like that. And so when we read a story like this, we learn some things from it typically, like God is great, God can overcome big stuff, but how does that really work as I'm working to overcome my addiction, or a marriage that's really difficult, or a parenting challenge, or a surgery next Thursday, or those, what does that have to do? And I think we miss the part of the story that God really intended for us to get, because embedded in this story of David and Goliath, which we feel like we know really, really well, is actually the way God builds in us the kind of relationship with Him and faith in Him that actually applies to those things I mentioned previously, like today's real life challenges. So if you've not heard the story of David and Goliath, spoiler alert, the underdog, the little guy, wins. Okay? 9.5-foot giant, teenage boy, probably 17 years old, slingshot, all kinds of equipment and gear, slingshot wins. Like that's the story. But let's go back to the story, because there's 4 ways in this story that God is attempting to work in your life that you might have missed. Like he's actually trying to do this right now in your life, and all you have to do is cooperate, and he'll build in you the kind of bold faith that David exhibited in his life. So think through your life with me today and ways you're saying yes or no to these 4 ways he's trying to build this faith in you, whether you're 17 or 77 or anywhere in between, or 7, right? This is how he works. This is what he does. The first thing that he does is he builds in us the faith that we need to face Goliath, the name of the giant, whatever the giant's going to be in your life, by partnering with us as we face everyday challenges. So the counseling appointment you have on Tuesday, the financial challenge you've got to face on Thursday, the surgery next month, those things, God, he could remove those from your path, and I wish he did. I wish he removed those things. Generally, though, he chooses not to. He chooses to walk with us through our everyday challenges to build our faith. Let me read to you from the story of David and Goliath. So David, in this part of the story in 1 Samuel 17, is trying to convince King Saul of Israel that he should be even allowed to fight Goliath. He has to go before the king and say, here's why I think I can fight Goliath. And he says this. Saul says, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth. But David says to Saul, your servant, when he says he's your servant, he's talking about himself. He says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he's defied the armies of the living God. It says, what God did for me with a lion, he'll do for me with this big giant. Little background on the story. David is the youngest in his family, and in David's time, when you were the youngest in your family, you were considered to be very, very, very unimportant. I'm the oldest of my siblings, and so I think this is right. This is the way life should be, right? So, but especially in David's day, if you were the last child, you were really nothing for your whole life. And so David is left caring for the sheep, which is sort of the lowest position in that era of time. And his brothers, we'll meet one of them in a minute, are off fighting. So David, told to just go out and take care of sheep, is out there with the sheep, invites God into his workplace, even though it's considered to be menial. And when a lion or a bear comes, he makes a choice that you and I might not make. So if I'm 16, I'm watching sheep, probably don't love sheep, a lion comes, what do I do? What do you do? I say, most likely, you win some, you lose some, right? I mean, every great business has some depreciation, right? Lions have to live and eat, right? Why not? But not David. He's like, okay, this is a challenge that I'm responsible to face. Maybe God will be with me. And he faces the lion and he faces the bear, and it works. And you don't face a lion or a bear with your bare hands and come out alive and not know that God is with you, right? Like, actually, right at this time last year, I was on a sheep hunt in Alaska, and as we were having dinner, a large brown bear we saw in the distance had caught whiff of our dinner and was running full speed at us. I'll tell you what I did not do. I did not grab it by the hair of its face and go, face to face with this thing. I did something different than that. And this is what David learns by faith. Let me see if I can explain it this way, because I had an event in my life that Whenever I think of the way God uses everyday challenges to build our faith, this always comes to mind. I had long wanted to climb Devil's Tower. For years, I'd go visit with people who'd come to visit us, and I'd look at that thing and I'd see people climbing. Wow, that would be cool to be on top. Any of you climbed Devil's Tower? We got to have a few people here. Yeah, several of you have climbed Devil's Tower. So I wanted to be cool like you all, right? That's what basically. And so the problem, though, I don't do well with heights. 20, 30, 40 feet, I start to get uncomfortable. 100 feet, I get shaky. And beyond that, bad things start to happen, right? And so I knew that probably. Finally, though, a few years ago, a friend talked me into trying to climb Devil's Tower with him. So I got all kind of psyched up for it, and we met there at the base. And a few years ago anyway, I don't know if this is still the case, but you had to take a little orientation class to climb Devil's Tower. And so we sat, and a young lady there who climbed it many times was teaching us about the strength of the rope and the carabiner and the harnesses and all the other gear that some of you know better than I do, and went through that little instructional course, and she was very convincing about the strength of everything and how safe it was. And I believed her. Like, intellectually, I got it. Like, yeah, that sounds pretty safe. And so then you start, and initially it's kind of like about that, straight up, and you go through some bouldering, and you get up there a first phase. That's good, that's fine. But then the route anyway that my used-to-be friend took me on, we reached a point that felt like, to me, was more like that, and was in my opinion, very sheer. Now, my friend was a typical rock climber, about 130 pounds, and it's just one big muscle, right? And I'm 200, none of your business, and it ain't one big muscle, okay? And so we get to this point. He just shimmies up this thing, anchors in up there, and says, I think it's called en belay. Some of y'all know en belay, which I learned to hate that day. But en belay, which basically meant my turn to climb. So I climb, and I remember this section so clearly because I got about halfway up, and I lost it. Every handhold and foothold I thought I had slipped, and whoop. And the guy up on top, that person who's belaying you can really kind of decide how far you fall. And I fell a long, long ways. And I screamed like a kindergartner. I mean, I just screamed. My apologies if you're in kindergarten, but I let it out. He says I asked for my mother. Don't remember that, but I don't remember everything I said, so it's possible. But I hit. It caught. And the only thing you can do in that situation is try. And I tell this story because I fell, my memory is 4 times on that one section. Again, it's a used to be friend now because of this situation, right? But here's why I tell the story. Is on the 4th time, it was kind of fun. I actually remember falling the 4th time and enjoying it. If you've never been airborne on this side of Devil's Tower, you should try it sometime. It's rather enjoyable. And I asked this question: what had changed between the first fall and the 4th fall? What had changed is I had come to believe that I was safe, that it was going to be okay. Not just intellectually, but really at the heart of what we believe at a gut level. And this is what happens with God. You can hear teachers, preachers, you can go to services, you can read script, you can do all kind of stuff. But until you have faced a lion or a bear and put that in the context of your life, you face an everyday challenge in which God clearly was with you, not somebody you heard about. You won't know for yourself that God is with you. And the only way to do that is to face whatever's coming this week, this month, this year, and say, God, let's do this together. I invite you into it, and I'll do the hard thing that I am scared to do. Be with me. And what you'll discover is when you step out in faith in that way and you discover God's for real, your heart grows a little bit. and you're more and more ready to face Goliath because giants are coming in your life. That's the reality. Giants are coming. The second way that God builds faith is through criticism. Now, I want to read to you an exchange between Eliab and David. Let me set the stage on who Eliab is, because Eliab is David's older brother. Eliab would have been David's hero. Eliab would have been the captain of the football team, if you will, and David would have not been allowed to go out for football, but he would have loved, to put it into our context a little bit. Eliab is a warrior. He's been at the battle. If you know the story, for 40 days, this giant has come out and challenged everybody in the nation of Israel, including Eliab. They've gotten up every morning as these Israelite warriors, these Jewish warriors. They've gotten up every morning. They've gotten excited. They've sung Kumbaya or whatever. They've gotten themselves pumped up. They had a big breakfast, ham and eggs, and the whole night. Actually, not ham, but the whole 9 yards. And they've gotten all excited, and they've gone to the battlefront, and they've seen Goliath. And every time for 40 days, they said, "Holy cow, he's big. Wow, I think he's bigger today than yesterday." And they've shrunk back, which felt okay because everybody else was shrinking back. But now the shepherd boy, the 17-year-old kid, says, "I'll take him on." And listen to what happens here. It says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? You're just a shepherd boy, right? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." David says, "What have I done? Can I even speak?" And then he turned away to someone else. When you take on a challenge, you name it, okay? You name it, a marriage challenge, a health challenge. You take on a relational challenge that's been in conflict maybe in your family for a couple generations. Whatever it is that you take on, you will have people around you, and sadly some of the closest people in your life will do this. They've been shrinking back from a similar challenge their whole life. And now that you're stepping out and maybe going to do it imperfectly, they'll criticize and give a lot of input. And you have a choice in that moment. You can turn to the criticizer and get into it with them. If David had done that, this would be the story of David and Eliab, not David and Goliath, right? Probably wouldn't have made the Bible, but that's what it would have been. And that can be our story, or you can continue forward into what God is calling you to do. You'll have to make this choice point, and when you do, when you move on from criticism, when you keep moving forward, you're going to find God builds your heart a little more. He uses criticism. None of us love it. None of us love everyday challenges. None of us love criticism. But God uses both of those to keep building our heart. His whole life, David has heard, he was just a shepherd boy. He'd never be a leader. He'd never amount to much. God wasn't with him like he was others. His whole life he'd heard that. And there may be a voice in your head and you've heard something your whole life. You got to move forward because it's not true. It's not true. The third way God builds our heart, and this is so interesting, he builds it by preparing each of us very uniquely in ways we don't seem to be able to recognize it until we faced the giant, and then we look back and say, actually, God was preparing me for that. But right now, if you let him and you cooperate with what he calls you to do, he's preparing you for the giant to come. So when you sit in that doctor's room someday and you get that news, he knows that already, and he's preparing you. Guarantee it. Watch what he's done in David's life. So this is an interesting story because Saul, the king, he decides to finally let David fight Goliath, but he says we know there's only one way you fight giants. Here's how you do it. You dress up in all this gear. And so he starts to put a bunch of gear. If you remember the story on David, it says Saul dressed David in his own tunic, He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. He fastened a sword over his tunic. And he tries walking around because he wasn't used to them. David finally says, I can't go in these. Like, I can't wear all this gear. I'm not used to them. So he took them off, and then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with the sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. He takes all the armor off, puts the sword down, all the gear that you had to take on giants with, and he says, all I know is slingshots. That's all I got. God's going to have to work through a slingshot because that's all I got. Now, time out for a minute. What we know in history after this event is that armies came to realize the best way to take on armored, large warriors was through a company of warriors called slingers who brought slingshots into the battle. Literally, this became a whole division of their, what we would call their sort of infantry group, were slingers. And in David's day, it wasn't like a slingshot we have, where the ones I have, you can pull it back and you shoot something that kind of goes like that. In David's day, they had a kind of spinning, leather strap spinning device, and they hurled a small rock at the almost at the same speed that we currently shoot a round out of a .45 auto pistol today. That's the feet per second velocity that they hurled rocks. And they were so good. There's a lot of stories in history about several of them being able to hit birds out of the air, the whole 9 yards. And what came to be, as I said, in military divisions was whole divisions of slingers who simply went into battle with slingshots and took out all the front line considered to be the giants of warfare. Took them out, because it turns out the best way to take out a completely armored 9.5-foot guy who's just covered up except for about right here, the best way to take that kind of guy out is with a rock going way over 2,000 feet per second that goes right there. That turns out to be the best way to do that. You see, unknowns to all the warriors of the time, God was preparing David perfectly for his giant. And the point I'm making is, he's preparing you today. And if you don't feel you have the education or the experience or the spirituality or whatever, the personality, the right Enneagram score, whatever it is that keeps you from facing something, you're wrong. God's with you. He's been preparing you for this. When something's in your path, He's got you ready. Just face it with Him. Face it with Him. Don't let criticism, don't let anything just keep moving forward. He's prepared you. Yes, you. The final thing. It's interesting how God uses crisis moments. When we face a crisis, He certainly, and we face that, He builds our faith. But He also builds our faith by, when you watch somebody else face a crisis moment with God, and God's with them, and they're not like a Bible character, they're like a buddy that you know is not perfect, but God's with them, your faith builds a bit, right? And so when we face giants, those around us who, when we give them advice or teach or anything, nah, but they're watching. Mom, dad, uncle, aunt, this is especially true for you. Guarantee you, your nephew is going to remember a lot more about what you did than what you said. Going to remember a lot more about how you faced whatever than what you said about that. Let me just read. It's in verse 52 of chapter 17. It says, this is right after David, and this is kind of a gory scene. David hits Goliath, goes up to him, literally cuts his head off, I'm sorry, and holds it up, right? That's the scene. That's why I loved it as like a kid. This is just a great, rated whatever you want scene, okay? This was amazing. But then all these guys who had been shrinking back for 40 days like Eliab, they see this, and here's what happens. It says, the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and the gates of Ekron. all of these people who had been afraid now get courage. And when you stand up to whatever it is, when you're the first one in your family to stand up to something, when you're the first one in your group of peers to make a change that others think you can't make, it's inspiring. And God uses that to build that. So, most of you know my dad. He actually teaches here about every Sunday. And I had what was mostly a privilege of growing up with him as my dad. Hopefully he's watching. His parenting style was 99% fantastic, but sometimes could be a little challenging. Let me see if I can explain. And in doing so, I will share with you a memory that really built my faith as I observed him. So when I was in grade school, I attended an incredibly rough school. Lots of bad stuff happened at my school. It was known that way, and sure enough, when I went to it, it was real. It was stuff. And I'd come home from school as a second grader, third grader, fourth grader, on and on. And I'd share with my dad the amazing stories that I witnessed and the stuff that wasn't good, wasn't right, like bad stuff. And I thought, even in those days, I thought, this is something you might want to call my teacher about or my principal about or whatever. Like, somebody's got to know about this. That wasn't Dad's deal. Dad would listen, and he would say, okay, wow, that is horrible. That's, what did you do about that? I ran. That was always my response. I ran, Dad. There's nothing I could have done about that. Well, that's wrong, isn't it? Maybe for you, but not for me, right? I mean, I got to be honest. I remember these conversations because there was a bunch of them. Well, we talk about following Christ, and he cared for the least of these, and justice is a big part of that, and you have to stand with these kids. I could give you the whole half-hour, thing that I got there. And I always walked away from those conversations. I'll be real honest. I always said, boy, if Dad was at my school, it'd be a better place. I'm just going to steer clear of those situations. Something changed in me a little bit, though. In fourth grade, we were, as a family, driving down a paved road, but a country lane. And I'm remembering this as a fourth grader, and you might find it a little odd what I do remember and what I don't. I'll just share with what I do remember, and I remember it because of how it impacted my life. We're driving down this country lane, and all of a sudden, the van that we're driving in, Dad just slams the brakes on and backs it up. And rolls his window down, which at this, I'm an old man, so in this age, it's one of these deals, right? So he rolls it down, and he yells out the window across the road, and so my brothers and I turn to see what's going on, and there's a man. My memory is an incredibly large man, but a large dude who has a woman by the neck. She's shaking her and has her bent over, and it's shaking her. It's a blue Nova. He had a blue Nova. Well, again, fourth grade. I remember odd things. And he's shaking her, and Dad yells for him to stop. And he's startled because people had been driving by, and he's startled, and he stands up, and he looks at my dad, and he lets her go, and Dad's asking her, do you have a place you can get where it's safe? And the guy looks at my dad and takes a couple steps towards him, and she's kind of staggering off. And probably seat belts had been invented, but in my family, it was pre-seat belt, okay? So all of us are now glued to the side window, just like, what the heck is going on? And then the guy does something as Dad's trying to make sure she's getting somewhere that's safe, and they're communicating, and I don't remember a lot of that, except what I do remember while that's going on is this guy goes around and opens his trunk up and pulls out, we used to have these big 4-prong tire irons, you remember those big things? And he pulls one of those out of his trunk, And he starts to walk towards us across the road as she takes off. And he starts to explain to my dad what he's going to do to my dad with that tire iron. And I remember that because he uses words I had never heard before. They were new words, exciting words, creative. He was a creative young man. Just explained what you could do to a body with a tire iron. And I'll never forget some of those things. We won't go into that now, but it was very interesting. And he starts to walk. He has about, 15, 20 feet on a dirt lane. Then he has to get to pavement, so he's walking towards us. Now, this is when I first remember my mom entering into the conversation. Because it's at this point that she starts to have some very specific instructions about what my dad should do next. This is pre-smartphone, right? So we're not going to just call, but she starts to explain what we could do and where we could go and all these kind of things. And there starts to be a little debate on the front seat up there about this, and the guy continues to walk yelling at the top of his lungs. That's when my dad decided to get out of the van. Now, I remember him saying, lock the doors. I've left the keys. If this doesn't work out, you need to leave. I remember my mom basically violently disagreeing with this plan and communicating some pretty strong stuff. Probably, I think it was fourth grade. I think that's the strongest I've ever heard my mom communicate anything to anybody, just to give you an idea. Very strong. But my dad goes through with the plan, shuts the door, and I mean in the back seat, we're like below the window, above the window, right? Like, this is crazy. And this guy, he gets bigger as he gets closer, the whole 9 yards. My mom, it's just noisy. It was fascinating, I'll tell you right now. Anyway, so the guy keeps walking, and then he gets about 3 or 4 feet from my dad, stops, turns around, walks back, throws his tire iron in his car as he jumps in. I remember, again, fourth grader, you remember weird things. Like, I remember him peeling out. We called it peeling out, as a kid. And he kind of spins around and takes off. And then there was just this pause for a moment in the back seat. You're like, wow. Then Dad tries to get back in the van, but Mom won't let him. And so there was a period of negotiation that occurred there. I think some lifestyle changes were made in our family. I don't know all the details. You have to ask them, but there was some negotiation. Finally, Dad's allowed back in the van, and I remember driving to a police station in a nearby community, and I don't know what they did from there, and I don't know how the story ended from there because I don't remember anything else except one thing. Long story, but something happened in me as it related to my faith in God at school. That could have never happened despite the fact that I received a lot of teaching, a lot of other stuff, but I had to see it. I had to know, wait a minute. You can face stuff. And you can trust that in some form God will be with you, and whatever God chooses to do, it will be enough. This is real. And I'm telling you, in this room, you need to know that you weren't just created for you. You were created to be a light set on a hill, Scripture teaches us. And the world changes when we see somebody else who believes that this God we sing about is so real that we'll stand with him, and whatever he chooses for our life, he will be enough. He will be enough. I want to pray with you if you would this morning. Father in heaven, it's been my privilege to offer some things that I have personally learned and ways that you're working in my life. And you know this, God. I'm not there yet on this stuff. But you've become such a friend for me. I wish, God, there's just some stuff you'd remove from my path. And we talk about this, don't we? We talk about this. I don't always understand why you don't just take some stuff away, because it sometimes hurts. And it sometimes is hard. But I know this now, that every time I face whatever, if I invite you in, you're enough. And when it's over, I believe in you a bit more. I still have doubts. I'm still not all the way there yet. I don't think I'm ready for a 9.5-foot giant, right? But I'm more ready than I was yesterday. And I'm just going to keep saying yes. And maybe there's some people in this room who today will say, I'll keep saying yes. I'll keep saying yes, and you'll just live with me more and more. Oh God, for the sake of those around us, help us to be giant slayers, the kind of giants we face in our life, the real life challenges that other people need inspiration about. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you. You're awesome to talk to. Find some air conditioning and enjoy your day.